How is it possible that some people actually get richer after they stop working? Because that doesn't seem to make any sense. Your whole life, you've been conditioned to believe a simple logic. More work, more income, more money. And retirement is supposed to be the exact opposite of that. Less work, no paycheck, no active income coming in. So logically, your money should stop growing, or at the very least, start going down. But that's not what happens for a lot of people. In fact, there's a group of people who enter retirement and keep seeing their wealth grow, sometimes even faster than before. And no, this isn't about luck. It's not about inheritance, and it's definitely not about some fancy investment strategy. It comes down to something much simpler and way more overlooked: how the financial system changes after you retire. Because the retirement game is not the same as the accumulation game. The rules change, the incentives change, and what used to feel like slow growth before can turn into accelerated growth later, but only for the people who understand what's actually happening. Today, you're going to see exactly that. Why money can grow faster after retirement, even without a paycheck. And more importantly, why most people never get to experience it. Let's take this out of theory and put it into something you can actually see. Picture two retirees, same age, same net worth, $800,000 invested. Same decision, stop working. Up to this point, everything's the same. Now watch what happens over the next few years. Retiree 1, they enter retirement with a simple mindset. Now I need to protect what I have. So they start making some adjustments. They reduce risk exposure, move part of the money into more conservative investments, avoid volatility. None of that sounds wrong. Honestly, it sounds responsible. Now, on top of that, they start withdrawing money monthly to live. Nothing unusual. Everything feels under control. Retiree 2. Now look at the second one. They enter retirement with a different mindset. Now the system needs to keep working. They also adjust their portfolio, but not with the goal of avoiding risk, with the goal of maintaining growth. They understand the money still needs to work, and that eliminating risk completely means eliminating growth. Now hold on to that, because this is where the difference starts to show up. Year 1, they're both doing fine. No major changes, no big differences. If anything, the first retiree might feel better, less volatility, more sense of safety. Year 3, now something subtle starts happening. The first one has less fluctuation, but also less growth. The second one keeps growing, even with withdrawals. Year 7. Now the difference is visible. The first retiree starts noticing something off. Their wealth isn't growing like they expected. It's slowly being consumed. Nothing dramatic, but consistent. Meanwhile, the second retiree starts noticing something counterintuitive. Even while withdrawing money every month, their net worth stays stable or even grows. And this is where the question that changes everything shows up. How can someone withdraw money and still end up richer? Because if you look at it on the surface, that seems impossible. But once you understand what's happening underneath, you realize it's not just possible, it's predictable. And the difference between these two cases isn't about how much they have. It's about how the system behaves after retirement begins. Now, let's open this up, because there are a few specific factors that make this happen. And once you understand those factors, everything starts to make sense. The first thing that changes in retirement isn't the market. It isn't your investment. It's your behavior. More specifically, how you spend. During your working years, most people live in a kind of invisible mode, spending money to buy time. You pay for convenience. You eat out often. You pay for services. You outsource tasks. You go for quick solutions. Not because you want to spend more, but because you don't have time. Now, think about what happens when that changes. In retirement, you go from time scarce to time rich, and that completely reshapes your spending without you even noticing. You start to cook more at home, handle things yourself, cut recurring costs, avoid stress-driven impulsive spending, and that creates a quiet effect. What this changes in practice, your cost of living goes down, or at least it grows much more slowly than before. And that directly impacts the system, because now you need to withdraw less money from your portfolio. And that detail is huge. because the growth of your wealth doesn't depend only on how much it earns. It depends on how much you take out of it. If you reduce your withdrawals even a little, you extend the time your money stays invested. And when your money stays invested, it keeps growing. Now connect that to what we talked about earlier. The second retiree doesn't grow just because they invest better. They grow because their system requires less withdrawal. And that creates a structural advantage. Because less withdrawn today means more capital tomorrow. More capital tomorrow means more growth later. And this happens without extra effort, without taking more risk, without chasing higher returns, just by changing the way you consume. And here's the part almost nobody notices. You don't need to earn more to get richer in retirement. Sometimes you just need to stop losing efficiency in how you spend. And this is only the first factor, because there's another one that completely changes the equation. And this one comes straight from the financial system itself. Now, here's a factor most people don't really understand, but it completely changes the outcome. Taxes. During your working years, you're in the worst possible setup. You earn active income, and that's usually the most heavily taxed kind of income there is. Before the money even hits your account, a chunk of it is already gone. Federal tax, state tax, mandatory contributions. In many cases, 30, 40%, or even more. Now look at what happens in retirement. Your income changes its nature. You stop depending on a paycheck and start depending on planned withdrawals, benefits, investment income. And that completely changes how taxes are applied. The invisible effect. You can spend the same amount or even less and still pay less tax on it, because now you control how that income shows up. You can blend different sources, adjust how much you withdraw, choose where the money comes from. And that gives you something you never really had before. Tax efficiency. Now connect that to growth. If you pay less in taxes, you keep more of your money. If you keep more capital stays invested. And more invested capital creates more growth. And all of this happens without changing market returns, without taking on more risk, without doing anything fancy, just by changing the structure of your income. Now go back to the two retirees. The first one doesn't pay attention to this. They withdraw without a strategy. Pay whatever comes. Just go with the flow. The second one understands that taxes are a controllable variable. They organize their withdrawals. They spread out their income. They stay efficient over time. Result? Even with the same net worth, one keeps more money than the other. And over time, that turns into growth. And here's the core idea. During accumulation, you grow despite taxes. In retirement, you can grow because of how you handle them. That's the second factor. But there's still one more. And it might be the most counterintuitive of all, because it happens in how the money behaves, not in how you behave. There's a moment that almost nobody notices when it's happening, but it completely changes how growth works. It's the moment when your wealth stops growing mainly because of your contributions and starts growing because of itself. During the accumulation phase, the game is simple. You work, you invest, you push the portfolio forward. Growth exists, but it still depends a lot on you. Now think about what happens after decades of doing that. You've built capital, and that capital starts generating bigger returns. And here's the part most people don't really get. Growth isn't linear. It's compounding. At the beginning, you invest and see very little. But after years, that growth starts creating more growth. Now connect that to retirement. When you reach this stage, the system is already mature. And that means even while you're withdrawing money, what's left is still big enough to keep growing. Let's make it simple. If your portfolio generates around 6% a year and you withdraw 4%, there's still growth left. That's actually the logic behind what's often called the 4% rule, where retirees withdraw a portion while letting the rest keep compounding over time. And that remaining growth keeps stacking year after year. And that's exactly what creates that strange feeling. You stop working, but your wealth keeps moving forward. Now go back to the two retirees. The first one doesn't understand this dynamic. They cut too much risk. They interfere with the portfolio. They reduce the growth potential. Result? The system stops being self-sustaining. It starts depending too much on withdrawals. The second one understands they've reached the phase where the money needs to keep operating. They keep a structure that allows growth, even with withdrawals. Result? The system stays alive. And here's the most important point in this entire video. Retirement is not the moment when growth stops. It's the moment when growth should finally take over. But that only happens if you don't interrupt the process. Because if you dismantle the system at this stage, you lose exactly what took decades to build. Now, put it all together. Less withdrawal, more tax efficiency, and a system that's already mature. And you start to see why some people actually get richer after they retire. But here's the important detail. This doesn't happen automatically. In fact, most people never get to experience this. And that's exactly where we need to close the loop. Now you can start to see something that wasn't so obvious at the beginning. Retirement is not the moment when growth ends. For some people, it's exactly when it truly begins. But not because of luck, not because of a specific investment, and not because they did something extraordinary after they stopped working. It's because the system finally became efficient. Less money going out, more money being kept, and a portfolio that's already large enough to keep growing on its own. And that completely changes how you look at everything. Because if you really think about it, most people spend their entire lives focused on one thing: accumulating, earning more, investing more, growing more, but almost no one stops to understand what happens after. What changes when you no longer depend on active income? What changes when time starts working in your favor? What changes when your money no longer needs you, but still depends on your decisions? Because maybe the most important point in all of this is this: retirement doesn't reward the person who accumulated the most. It rewards the person who built a system that keeps working, even after the effort stops. And that leads to a question that's worth more than any number. If you stop today, would your money keep growing, or would it start shrinking? Because the answer to that question doesn't show up in your balance. It shows up in the structure you built along the way. And maybe that's exactly what defines who's actually ready and who hasn't realized yet what still needs to be adjusted.